In June 2025, the world watched as the United States under President Donald Trump launched precise airstrikes on Iran's key nuclear facilities, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The strikes marked a dramatic escalation in U.S.-Iran tensions, breaking years of proxy conflict and sanctions with direct military action. Hours later, Trump stunned the world by announcing a ceasefire between Iran and Israel, pivoting from force to diplomacy in classic Trumpian style. This sequence, military strike followed by a ceasefire, sparked fierce debate. Was it a strategic masterstroke or a reckless gamble that could destabilize the region? As diplomats prepared for talks and analysts assessed the fallout, the world held its breath, uncertain if this was the dawn of peace or the prelude to wider war. The Trump administration quickly declared the operation an overwhelming success, with Trump comparing the strike's impact to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth echoed this, claiming Iran's nuclear program was obliterated. The White House and Israeli officials insisted the strikes destroyed critical infrastructure, pushing back Iran's nuclear timeline by years. The administration's narrative, a model of modern warfare, precise, effective, and decisive. At a NATO summit, Trump reiterated, "It's been obliterated, totally obliterated," aiming to cement a singular truth about the mission's outcome. By immediately pivoting to diplomacy, the administration sought to control the narrative from conflict to resolution, positioning the U.S. as the region's power broker. The White House justified the recent military strikes as a necessary and measured response to what it described as Iran's escalating threat to regional and global stability. Officials emphasized that the decision was not made lightly, but after careful consideration of mounting evidence and intelligence reports. Iran's ongoing support for proxy militias across the Middle East, coupled with its increasingly aggressive nuclear ambitions, had raised alarms in Washington and among its allies. These militias, often armed and funded by Tehran, have been accused of destabilizing neighboring countries and threatening U.S. interests. The existential threat to Israel was central to the administration's argument. Officials warned that a nuclear-armed Iran would not only endanger Israel's security, but could also trigger a dangerous arms race in the region, emboldening Tehran's proxies and undermining decades of diplomatic efforts. After the U.S. withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal, Iran's uranium enrichment program accelerated rapidly. The administration claimed that diplomatic avenues had been exhausted, and that the use of force was now the only viable option to halt Iran's progress toward a nuclear weapon. Supporters of the strikes pointed to a series of Iranian provocations, attacks on international shipping in the Persian Gulf, the stockpiling of enriched uranium far beyond agreed limits, and repeated threats against U.S. allies, as clear evidence that Tehran was testing the world's resolve. They argued that only a decisive show of force could deter Iran from further escalation, and that inaction would be interpreted as weakness, inviting even greater risks in the future. The strikes were cast as a responsible intervention, designed not to provoke war, but to prevent a catastrophic nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Diplomats stressed that the goal was to restore deterrence and encourage a return to negotiations. The administration insisted that acting now, before Iran could cross the nuclear threshold, would avert a far worse future. They framed the operation as a difficult but essential choice, made in the interest of global security and the protection of allies. The message was clear. This was not an act of aggression, but a preemptive defense, an urgent move to prevent catastrophe and preserve the fragile balance of peace in a volatile region. Supporters of the strike saw it as a calculated show of American resolve, not reckless escalation. They argued that years of sanctions and diplomacy had failed, and a forceful approach was overdue. The airstrikes, followed by a ceasefire, were seen as a masterful play, using force to create leverage for negotiation. Analysts like Dan Perry suggested the strike could exploit Iran's internal pressures, perhaps even destabilizing the regime. Critics of the 2015 nuclear deal claimed it only paused, not ended, Iran's ambitions. The strike was a necessary course correction. The goal forced Iran to the table from a position of weakness, resetting the terms of engagement. For these advocates, the operation sent a clear message: America will act decisively to prevent nuclear proliferation. Critics warned the strikes could backfire, drawing parallels to Trump's 2018 withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. That move, meant to pressure Iran, instead accelerated its nuclear program. Critics fear the strikes will repeat this pattern. Attacking Iran, they argue, could unify its population behind the regime and strengthen hardliners who see nuclear weapons as essential for survival. The JCPOA had provided transparency and limits. Its collapse led to more secrecy and risk. Critics say the strikes may have driven Iran's program deeper underground, making it harder to monitor and control. The lesson from past interventions force often leads to greater instability, not security. The fear is that actions meant to show strength may ultimately make the world more dangerous. Analyst Daniel R. DePetris argued that the recent strikes would not deter Iran, but instead only deepen its resolve to pursue nuclear weapons. In his view, the leadership in Tehran now sees these weapons as absolutely vital for the regime's survival, a shield against foreign threats. Rather than backing down, Iran is likely to double down, convinced that nuclear capability is the only way to prevent future attacks and ensure its sovereignty in a hostile environment. The U.S. attack, DePetris warned, confirmed Tehran's deepest fears, namely, that giving up its nuclear ambitions would only invite more foreign intervention and leave the country vulnerable. For Iranian leaders, the strikes were not just a military action but a message that compromise could be fatal. The risk now is a dangerous cycle of escalation. Iranian retaliation could follow not just through direct military means, but also via regional proxy groups, increasing instability across the Middle East. Each move and countermove raises the stakes, threatening to draw the U.S. into a deeper, more unpredictable conflict. Even if key facilities are destroyed, Iran's nuclear knowledge and technical expertise remain intact. Its scientists can rebuild, adapt, and possibly relocate future sites to even more secretive and fortified locations, making detection and prevention far more difficult for the international community. DePetris and other experts insist that only a robust, verifiable diplomatic agreement can truly address the nuclear challenge. Military force, they argue, cannot erase scientific expertise or build the trust needed for lasting security. Without diplomacy, the cycle of suspicion and confrontation will only continue. The strikes, critics argue, have made diplomatic solutions even harder to achieve, hardening positions on all sides and locking the region into a perilous and uncertain future where mistrust reigns. The greatest fear now is that the operation may have ensured the nuclear threat not only persists but becomes more dangerous and hidden, pushing the world further from peace and closer to a new era of uncertainty. As the administration touted victory, a leaked U.S. intelligence report contradicted their claims, suggesting the strikes set back Iran's program by only months. The report, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, said Iran's core nuclear capability and expertise remained intact. The leak sparked a political firestorm, with the White House dismissing the assessment as premature and launching an investigation. This clash exposed the tension between political messaging and intelligence analysis. The leaked report suggested the operation was more symbolic than strategic, failing to cripple Iran's ambitions. The debate over the true impact of the strikes became central. Was this a masterstroke or a costly misstep? If the intelligence is right, the U.S. risked much for little gain, a potential strategic blunder. The fallout from the strikes played out on both domestic and international stages. For Trump, framing the operation as decisive but limited was key to appeasing his base, wary of endless wars. Announcing talks with Iran shifted the narrative from conflict to diplomacy, projecting Trump as both strong and pragmatic. At the NATO summit, the administration touted increased allied defense spending as another win for Trump's assertive approach. Yet, the leaked intelligence report fueled congressional criticism and demands for transparency, with delayed briefings heightening suspicion. Internationally, allies were divided, some quietly supportive, others worried about escalation and the fate of the JCPOA. The situation hung in the balance, with Trump's political fortunes and Middle East stability riding on whether this gambit could deliver real diplomatic progress. The June 2025 airstrikes on Iran's nuclear sites remain one of Trump's most consequential and controversial decisions, sending shockwaves through global politics and reigniting debates over the use of military force in international disputes. The world watched in real time as the strikes unfolded, with news outlets scrambling to interpret the implications and leaders across the globe issuing urgent statements. The operation was swift, precise, and left a trail of uncertainty in its wake. Supporters hail it as decisive action, a message that the US won't tolerate nuclear threats, and a move that could force Iran to negotiate from weakness. For many, it was a bold demonstration of American resolve, a clear signal that the US would not hesitate to act in defense of its interests and those of its allies. They argue that such strength is necessary in a world where adversaries constantly test boundaries. If the administration's claims hold, history may judge it a risky but successful play. Some analysts suggest that, by taking decisive action, the US may have set a new precedent for dealing with nuclear proliferation. The long-term impact, however, remains uncertain, as experts debate whether this approach will deter future threats or provoke further instability. Critics warn the strikes shattered hopes for diplomacy, empowered Iranian hardliners, and may have only delayed, not ended, the nuclear threat. They point to the surge in anti-American sentiment across the region, the collapse of ongoing talks, and the possibility that Iran will double down on its nuclear ambitions in defiance. For them, the operation represents a setback for peace and a catalyst for further conflict. The leaked intelligence report suggests the gains were minimal, the risks immense. According to insiders, the strikes may have only set back Iran's program by months, while dramatically increasing the likelihood of retaliation and regional instability. The true cost, both in terms of security and diplomatic fallout, is still being calculated. Ultimately, the operation is a test of two foreign policy visions: military strength versus diplomatic engagement. It raises fundamental questions about how best to confront nuclear threats, through force, negotiation, or a delicate balance of both. The world is left to weigh the merits and dangers of each path. As the world waits for the outcome, the question remains: was this a masterstroke that averted crisis, or a misstep that made one inevitable? The answer may shape not only the future of US-Iran relations, but the very nature of global security in the years to come.